Hey, what's up? I'm Jabran Malik with the Common Accord.
And I'm Yosef Zarnikin with Talmudka.com.
And today we're going to talk about Hadith science and like oral tradition, the science of using an oral tradition to verify religious texts, and the pros and cons, or the shortcomings, I should say, rather, of what's happened over the years with how that can be, how oral traditions can be misinterpreted or misapplied or thought of as authentic, only for people to look back and say, oh my God, this is just something that was folklore or doesn't really have a source in our tradition, but we take it as something as serious, as serious as Scripture itself.
And I think we're going to also show how comparatively you have many of these similar parallels in Jewish tradition with texts such as the Mishna, the Talmud, and other rabbinic texts.
So, with Islam in particular, because it's in the media and it's like super highlighted, where you have groups where they're extremists and where do they get these ideas from? And they say that we have the authentic Islam, like this is what it's supposed to be, this is how it is. And I'm sure you heard the term Wahhabi before.
Sure.
It's thrown all over the place. Saudi Arabia, Wahhabi, and stuff like that. So just to give a quick, concise history lesson to get people to understand where this mindset comes from, this extreme mindset. Because it's a grand scope, but Abdul Wahhab, who was the guy who founded that school of thought, he was born and lived in a time where the Ottoman Empire, in the 1700s and 1800s, was at its most liberal, extreme egalitarian, extreme...
as secular as can get.
As much as... And even today, out of all the Muslim countries, Turkey is the most... secularized,
right?
Which is not necessarily a bad thing if it's understood in the proper way. But in terms of religious watering down and saying that this is what the religion is, rather than having the breadth of understanding that you should have, that's what really got to people like Abdul Wahhab. And his whole thing was, he was writing from a place where the community felt that discontent, where it was like, this is getting way too liberal. And one extreme feeds the other.
Right.
So his narrative was, I'm gonna write books and I'm gonna write literature to get back to the real authentic Islam. But this is the thing. His understanding of authentic Islam, and most Muslims today, is an interpretation that was founded, or interpretations, I should say, a series of interpretations that were founded a few hundred years after the Prophet's death. Oh. So during the Middle Ages, certain scholars had written at a time when it was after the main corpus of Hadith, which I'll get into, was collected. And this is the reason why they rely so much on those sources rather than the earliest possible sources. Because they feel as at the later point, maybe in the 10th, 11th centuries, that these sources were more... all the work was done to collect these authentic sources, and then we can base an understanding of what Islam really is with all these sources now available to us.
So how is one able to differentiate between these innovations of Abdul Wahhab versus the earlier traditions that were collected?
Well, they have to literally go back and read. Like right now, for instance, most Muslims adhere to a commentary of the Quran by someone named Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir was a great commentator, a great Muslim scholar, but he was from the 14th century, from the 1300s. And Islam is from the 600s,
right,
from the 7th century. So he's a lot farther down.
Major time gap,
yeah. Now, there's an early tafsir, early commentary, by someone named At-Tabari, Persian commentator. And his was much earlier. It's within, I think it's about 200 years after.
Oh, wow.
So it's literally half the time of... In the span of time, Ibn Kathir is, about 400 or 500 years out, and the body is only a few hundred, or maybe 200 and some years out. And there's a great difference between their commentaries. And for instance, the body, the understanding of certain things in the Quran, a lot of people draw it from Ibn Kathir's commentary. Now, within Sunni mainstream Islamic literature, At-Tabari is just as good as Ibn Kathir in their understanding. It's just very rarely used as opposed to Ibn Kathir, because Ibn Kathir is someone who they just chose to say, okay, well, he's the commentary we're going to pull up most. So sometimes they pull up the body's commentary. Then there's also a commentary from one of the companions of the Prophet himself, Ibn Abbas. But there's some talk as to how authentic that commentary is. But nevertheless, there's a lot of earlier sources. And what's interesting is that they were very open-minded about the understanding of the text.
Both of them.
Well, Ibn Kathir less, and Tabari more. The earlier you go, the more open-minded, the more there's a broader way of interpreting text.
So besides being open-minded, how would you describe Tabari's style compared to Ibn Kathir?
Ibn Kathir.
How would you, in terms of method of interpretation and areas of focus?
Well, Ibn Kathir went more off of whatever sources were available to him in the Hadith that were already collected later. So he would use those sources to say, okay, this is why I have a clearer understanding of these verses, because of these certain sayings of the Prophet that were authenticated a few hundred years later that the body didn't have access to. That's the gist. He doesn't say that openly, but this is the gist of understanding of why people want to employ this later commentary versus the earlier commentary. So you would think naturally you would want the earlier commentary,
right?
But there is a logic that exists as to why the later commentary could be more accurate. So it's really the way you look at it. The thing about the body though, versus Ibn Kathir, is that the body literally would analyze the text and the way it described certain things and the order of the verses and so on and so forth. For instance, the body, and this is really controversial, the issue of right now we have Eid coming up, Eid al-Adha, which is commemorating the sacrifice of Abraham sacrificing his son. Yeah. So now his son, in modern Islamic understanding, and since especially the time of a few hundred years after Islam started, the later you go, the more consensus there was that it was Ismail or Ishmael. That was the one that was in the binding. But the earlier you go, the more the consensus leans to that it was Ishaq.
The text of the Quran itself is not clear about
it. It doesn't say the son's name. Mm-hmm. But in the order of verses, it's assumed that if you just look at it on the surface, it looks as if it's Ishmael, because it speaks about Isaac afterwards. But the way it speaks about it, according to Tabari's analysis, is that it was summarizing the story. It was at the end of the story, it talked about what the story was about or who it was about, and his way of analyzing the text was different. He was looking at it from a textual analysis,
right.
And also his sources were more. There was a debate. There were people that thought it was Ishaq, people thought it was Ismail. It was a debate. But as you go later in time and later in the commentaries, as far as the time is concerned, it just became more that it was just this one son, and there was no way it could be Ishaq. But that's a whole different. We can get into that, but it shows you the science of how to analyze text and how these extremist groups, don't allow that science to flourish. They're not looking at it as a science. They're looking at it as an absolute. They pick these certain books and say, this is who the Prophet was, based on these particular scholars of the Middle Ages, and this is the most authentic Islam. So when you see posts that say that, but ISIS or whatever extremist groups, they're just following Islam as it's supposed to be, and moderate Muslims, I'm getting tired of that term because it indicates that Muslims are some people that need to be controlled, that somehow you made them moderate. Now he's moderate. No, it's just Muslims. But that these guys are more authentic, and the more normal Muslims are not as authentic. They're not as dedicated to their text, and that's total nonsense. It has to do with what these individuals say is Islam, and that they say this is 7th century Islam as it should be practiced today and understood today. Whereas people from my background look at Islam the same way the early scholars did.
Right.
The early scholars were super open-minded. All the 4 main imams, or the 4 scholars that pretty much did all the jurisprudence for the majority of Islamic tradition, which is the Sunni tradition. All four of them said statements like, I can have one opinion today and change it tomorrow.
Right.
Don't hold on to it as if it's like, the final
Concrete
word. I can have a conclusion today and have a different conclusion tomorrow. Another one said, I can have an opinion today and I can throw it against the wall tomorrow. As that shows how much he can say that this is not even what it was, And they all were students and learned from each other and learned in the same circles. So they were extremely open-minded about their interpretations, and none of them called each other like what they have they call the takfiri business, where they say you're a kafir, which I know in Hebrew they have the same word, kafir. Yeah. So all of a sudden you're an infidel if you don't agree with my school of thought. They didn't think like that back in the early Islamic period. So Islam is much different than what the extremists say, and the science of understanding the oral tradition is so important, because a text can be in front of you, but what the text means and what it's talking about in the context is what it's all about. If we can't figure that out, you might as well put it in a museum somewhere.
We have to at least be open to the fact that, as you're stating, there is an entire science behind this with earlier precedents and authentic precedents, which even the so-called extremists or less moderate groups would agree are authentic, and you can't just dismiss them like that.
Yeah. You can't just write them off. It's not. I'm not. The things that I bring up, it might be something that might excite Muslims. It might get them to say, "Oh, what are you trying to say?" But you can go look it up. It's all there. So just because it bothers you, it's only bothering the preconceived notion that you were taught. And exactly. I think that's something that both Jews and Muslims, and I think anybody should keep in mind when they're learning new information.
100%. You see, in Jewish thought, we have literally an exact parallel to this. You have the famous commentator. He's printed in every single Chumash, or in the 5 books of Moses. You'll find him there. Rashi, the commentator Rashi.
Heard of him.
And Rashi is printed in almost every single Chumash in the 5 books of Moses. Actually, throughout the entire Hebrew Bible, kids are taught his commentary already from the age of 5, and they're taught to almost view the text of the Bible itself as if Rashi has the last word on the matter. When people don't realize that Rashi's intentions were not to give you, and his style in general, anybody who's gone through his commentary knows, he's not analyzing the text from a textual or originalist or grammatical perspective. Although he does offer grammatical insight at times, don't get me wrong, but the underlying purpose of the commentary was not to do that. He offers homiletical or more story-like interpretations to supplement the text, which everybody would agree is not interpreting the text itself, but just giving an additional layer or flavor of meaning to it. Now, this is extremely problematic. Why? Not because there's anything wrong with Rashi's commentary, but because people are using it as their foundation for the text. When our sages, the sages of the Talmud, the heirs of interpretive tradition, already tell us from the age of 5, or really from when the age of any kid, when he's able to speak, or when he or she is able to speak, is supposed to learn the language. And unfortunately, that is not really a point of emphasis nowadays for many parents and teachers in the Jewish world. Master the language first. I know that before kids learn the Quran, Arabic is learnt fluently, it's in their heads, it's drilled in, no questions asked.
But see, this is so crazy. This is so crazy because we actually have the same problem.
Oh, really?
We have, I think it was the last Eid or the last function that we had, or one of the last ones, we had a big argument because one of the things is a problem is that children are taught to memorize the Quran, and they call them a hafiz. My son became a hafiz, or my daughter became a hafiz, which means someone who memorized the entire Quran, but they don't know what a single word means.
Oh boy! So they just repeat it as if it's like a tape recorder.
Exactly.
So this is what our sages actually cautioned against. Your reading of the text is irrelevant. Monkeys could read too. Parrots can read too. That doesn't accomplish anything. Yeah. You have to know how the language functions. And we talked about Targum last time. Targum serves as the common translation based on how the people understood it. There's this term that's thrown around in the Jewish world. It's called peshat. Peshat, to the average Jew, if you tell them what does that mean, they'll tell you, it means a simple reading. Well, what's a simple reading? We in politics, in American politics, we have this all the time with the Constitution. People always say, the Second Amendment means this, the First Amendment means that. but who gets to decide what the simple reading is?
Yeah.
So this is what Targum lays out. Targum is the official legal translation of the Jewish people, and that is set basically by the Jewish Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
They have this, and it's not imposed upon the people, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
The people ultimately end up deciding what the text means,
Mm-hmm.
and they're the ones that give the authority to the Supreme Court to decide these things. We, the people. When it comes to matters of the text which are not legal, and this is a huge misconception in the Jewish world as well, there is no right or wrong. As you were stating earlier, it's a science which has multiple facets and multiple layers of interpretation, which, as long as they're true to the grammatical and contextual understanding of the text, it could mean X, it could mean Y.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that,
Yeah.
and it's beautiful to embrace these traditions. And I think that a lot of misconception, both in Islamic jurisprudence and in Jewish jurisprudence, stems from this.
We have a saying from the Prophet where it was actually a fight between two Muslims. Well, not really a fight, but one Muslim heard another Muslim reciting the Quran in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. It's not clear as to what that means when he says a certain way. Whether he was reciting it in the tonality was a certain way, or he was the dialect was not the Medinan, the Quraysh dialect,
Mm-hmm.
the dialect they used in that it was revealed in, or it wasn't in the right order, or something like that. So most likely it was something had to do with something with either the dialect or the way that the words would sound and probably mean, the way he was emphasizing the words in the recitation. So he's like, you're not reading the Quran the right way. So he takes that Muslim to the Prophet and he says, I saw him reciting it this way, and he's wrong, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the other guy said, no, I was reciting it the right way. He's wrong. And they said, who's right? And the Prophet said, you're both right.
Wow.
He said the Quran can be recited in 7 different ways. So don't fight over, and every way is the right way. So don't fight over small things like this, because the nations before you fought over these things and they were destroyed.
That's why they failed.
Yeah. Don't get caught up in these little things, because the meaning, the Quran has such a broad meaning. Even like La ilaha illallah.
Mm-hmm. And the Shahada.
Yeah, if you just knew if you understood the words, you can understand it on a simple level, and you can understand it on a deeper level, and every level that you understand it at, it's right.
That's right.
And it's so or kullu wallahu ahad.
Everything is one.
That God is one.
Yeah.
And even just the word ahad, it's the same word in Hebrew,
Yeah.
ahad, but that word itself, you can get into what the depth of meaning of just the of that word, the letters, and I had there's a Arabic professor in NYU that my cousin was going.
We were talking about
to
him
his
last
class.
time. Yeah.
And he was like, I was like, how do you, if you're getting this, you're going this crazy over like just the Arabic letters and the way it's constructed, how do you even read the Quran? He's like, I can't even read like more than 1 page of the Quran without my brain like going crazy. Because he was like, the meaning, I was like, so is it, tell me, you can tell me, is it like really a miracle? He's like, it is, because it's like the way it plays out, it has such a depth of meaning. And for people like to say that Islam is this fixed product, it literally takes away from that miracle, because that in Islam, that is the miracle. It wasn't about bringing people back from the dead and all these different magical things, or not magical, but miracles that were visual miracles. It was understood that had passed already. That it didn't make a difference on people like that, or it didn't completely convey the idea that someone can come and do all these miracles and you still won't get it. You could have in the Quran, it says the angels could be coming down from the sky and they'll be like, this is magic. And it's true,
Yeah.
People today, if they don't believe in anything, what will get them to believe? I mean, you'll still be like, it must have been an alien or something. Like, I still won't believe it's God or something like that. So that understanding in it of itself prevents them from ever finding a certain truth, if it's possible to find it. So that's a whole nother conversation. But this science of hadith and oral literature is extremely important for it to be open. That's really the main goal. It's not, because the minute we say this is what it is, even if that is what it is, and we kind of stop people from having a discussion, we become no different from any other extremist group. Even if we're doing something positive, even if our what we're saying is the right thing,
right,
and what they're doing is wrong, it's the method that you have to be cautious of.
Is that just simply being dishonest to the history that precedes you and to the reality?
Exactly. And if you're right, then the person who wants to have that conversation with you and being open, he'll come to that conclusion as well.
Right.
So you don't have to be like, this is what it is. If that's what it is, let it be. And people will find that just by researching and studying and critical thinking and stuff like that, they'll come to it. You don't have to be so, that's what they say shows it shows that a person doesn't understand the text. That they don't want to touch it because they don't understand.
They don't understand.
Which gives it a higher chance that they could be wrong. Because
shows you the insecurity that they actually hold.
Exactly.
Which causes them to look at it in this narrow vacuum. Almost.
Exactly. And so to get into Hadith science, which Muslims, we used to leave it to the scholars, but I think now we live in a day and age where we have so much information available to us, and we have so many people nitpicking Islam and Jewish tradition as well. Whatever tradition, the people themselves have to become more educated about their own text. You can feel comfortable being a Muslim or being a Jew in a place where people are not nitpicking your texts, and not saying that, oh, but I heard the Talmud says this, but I heard it says in your scripture, I heard in the Hadith it says this. We see this time and time again.
Yep.
And they take things out of context or
love to pick and choose.
Yeah. So we need to educate ourselves a bit more, and we need to at least understand the basic science of oral tradition. And in Islam, in Hadith science, what we have is what they did was they had all these sayings of the Prophet. They had the Quran, which was a uniform text, and it was solid in the same lifetime of all the companions. It was all agreed upon. Hundreds and thousands of people memorized it. Nobody could just say, okay, this is what this verse says or whatever.
Right.
They all heard it. But with the Hadith, it was sayings of the Prophet, things that people heard him say, but in different instances and places. So they knew right away that there's going to be, it's not going to be as accurate as, say, the Quran, which everyone memorized and heard. So how do we know which one is accurate, which one is not? Now, in the early period, the time of the Islamic jurisprudence, the four Imams, there was still a lot of Hadith floating around that people would end up finding out that this was authentic.
Right.
And this is part of the reason why they were so open-minded about their interpretation of jurisprudence, because they knew that they didn't have all the information and that some new information could pop up or some new insight can come up.
Right.
But there were certain individuals in the 9th and 10th centuries that did a mass mission to collect all the sayings. They went all over the Muslim empire to meet anyone who had something that they heard from their father or from somebody they trusted, going back to the Prophet himself. And what these people did, most notably the most famous one, Imam Bukhari, right? Which is considered the strongest authentic book after the Quran in Islamic tradition.
By all schools of Islamic thought?
By all schools of Islamic thought. In Sunni jurisprudence. In the Sunni fold. So, what he did was, he went and collected, some say up to from 30,000 to 100-something thousand hadith, all around the Muslim empire. And he went on a journey to find every single person, and then from there, he narrowed the hadith down using a science and a methodology where he tested the person's character in the community, the person he heard it from, whether or not people say he's a trustworthy person or not. The person that he heard it from, which obviously Bukhari never met, but what that person's character was in the community as it was known in the place that they live. Oh, he was a notable character, he was trustworthy as well.
So you can trust the testimony.
Yeah, my father told me he was trustworthy. Yeah, we know who he heard it from or whatever. And then to verify the person he heard it from, sometimes it was 3. It was on average 3 chains.
Oh wow!
Going back to the Prophet, because that's how many generations out he was. And then from there he would also categorize them as hadith that were ahad, which meant singular, meaning only this person heard it.
Oh, okay.
So I only got this one hadith that this situation or this thing was said by this one chain of transmission. Then you would have hadith that were mutawatir, which means that so many people, so many different unrelated people have somebody that they heard it from that heard the Prophet say this, that it's pretty much undisputed that he said this. Now the accuracy, now there's a variance in the text. So some people, according to this person, the hadith is slightly different. According to this person, that same hadith is slightly different. So then in that variance, there's mutawatir in text, and then there's mutawatir in meaning. So mutawatir in text means that everybody heard the Prophet say this, and there's no difference in the text. And the singular statements are more concise. So there's for instance, one of them where it says, "Don't say that I'm better than the Prophet Jonah." Singular statement. There's no context as to when he said it exactly or why he said it exactly. But so many different people heard him say that it's undisputed that he said that. And it's mutawatir in meaning because it's so concise and short. Then there's texts that are undisputed, but the meaning is not undisputed. So part of it could be undisputed, but not the entirety of the hadith.
Right.
So what's common in every single version of it is what's undisputed, but what's not common in every single version of it, there's some open possibilities for interpretation or understanding. But Bukhari did as much as he could with what he had, and he put it in this book, and this is why they say this is why they say it's the second most authentic book. But the issue is that the weak hadith that he collected are still floating around. There are a few publications, not many, but a few that collected all the weak hadith just to publicate it, to show people, like, if you heard this
that's where it comes from.
This was fabricated. It's floating around, but it's not true. So they collected all the weak ones just to show, like, if you heard this from your local whatever, it's not true. But there's also weak hadith that are used in Islamic jurisprudence, later Islamic jurisprudence, which is now modern. And this is a debate that I've had with some Muslims, where it's used because it's talking about something that the Quran did not mention at all. So the logic behind it in one end is, we'll use this even if it's weak. My take on it is, it ends up becoming doctrine. And just because the Quran didn't talk about it, this is still a weak hadith, which means that it's possible that this is fake, that the Prophet never even said this.
So why compel someone to say that this is authentic doctrine?
Exactly. So what your intent is that you know it's weak,
right,
and that you use it in Islamic jurisprudence because there's nothing else available. But the common man doesn't know that, and mistakes can be made, and then you also have politics that get involved, and certain dynastic rulers that use certain hadiths and promoted certain ones.
Easily abuse it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have it's a very deep science. It's a very deep science. So that's pretty much what it is in the Islamic tradition, and that's really what just Muslims need to educate themselves on a little bit more. And if they don't have the time to do that, they shouldn't be so stern on what Islam is and what Islam isn't. You know,
right?
Be proud to be a Muslim. You don't have to concern yourself. Salvation in Islam has nothing to do with whether or not you establish a caliphate or anything like that. All you have to do is believe in God, believe in the prophets, pray 5 times a day. If you can make up the pilgrimage, do it, and if you can afford to, and then fast in Ramadan and give charity. That's literally all, the 5 pillars of Islam. Nothing about Islam says you need to make a caliphate and all this. This is why Muslims have been living in America without bringing it up ever for years. It's only been a recent thing where all this, all these groups of coming out saying these things.
So I would love to elaborate on the exact same parallel which exists in Jewish tradition, and the one that parallels Ibn Bukhari in our tradition is someone by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, or Judah the Prince. And what happened was there was massive persecution which occurred at the time of the Second Temple era, a few hundred years after the Second Temple was destroyed, and much of the Jewish archives of the temple were being lost. They were destroyed, they were being burnt by the Romans, and people didn't know what the precedent that the Jewish High Court held. Mm-hmm. It was being lost, and there were opinions floating around, like you were saying. There's a name for that in Jewish law, by the way. It's called halacha rofefet, a floating law, a weak law which can't be verified. So what did Judah the Prince do? He did exactly what Ibn Bukhari did. He gathered whatever archives were around that were collected by students and by the teachers of the time, which were, by the way, authenticated, bona fide teachers. You couldn't just be any Joe Schmo. These people had a special title, a Mosaic ordination, and these people essentially helped gather whatever authentic or whatever laws of which were able to be traced back to the Jewish High Court, and he compiled them into a work which is called the Mishna. And people often take Mishnah out of context, and they say, well, and later on in the Talmud they say, oh, well, it says in the Talmud here this, it says in the Talmud here that. But, we have all these various compilations, and you have to ask yourself, well, what is binding, what isn't? And what could be imposed as doctrine upon people, and what isn't? And that's a massive topic for discussion, and I'm not going to get into the details right now, but to just wrap up, the underlying purpose, as Maimonides states, behind these works is to teach people what he calls derech hamishpat, the path of the law, not to set a narrow, set in stone tradition, which is my way or the highway. No. That was not the function of the Mishnah. The function of the Mishnah was to guide you in a particular path, which has multiple roads, and hopefully, in both our traditions, we should find each road which is appropriate for us, and that'll clear up, hopefully, a lot of the misconceptions and bring about peace.
God willing. Sounds good.
This was very nice.
Great talk again, man.
Yeah, for sure.
Look forward to the next one.
I can't wait.